It seems to me that one of the major claims of the New Testament is that Jesus fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament. In other words, that was an apologetic, right? In Acts chapter 2, in Acts chapter 13, the sermons of Paul, the sermons of Peter that quote the book of Psalms, David being a prophet, looked ahead of time. Okay? So that seems to be a major issue, is that the Old Testament truly did predict a Messiah, and Jesus fulfilled those predictions. However, at least in our circles, many times we're told that the New Testament actually twists and abuses the Old Testament, that what the New Testament claims to be prophecies are no prophecies at all. Now, interestingly enough, you even hear this in many Christian scholarly circles where they're scratching their head. And the big issue is, how does the New Testament use the Old Testament? And so I often hear kind of a pleading for special hermeneutic, that the New Testament authors could see things in the Old Testament that the Old Testament authors never meant or intended. But then the question of apologetics, how is that then an apologetic for the messiahship of Jesus? So I wanted to talk to you. Do you actually think that the New Testament handles the Old Testament well? Does the Old Testament really predict the Messiah? And does Jesus actually fulfill those prophecies?
The early Jesus followers cited the Tanakh in a wide range of ways. So sometimes it's making a direct fulfillment of something that was promised. Sometimes it's just making an analogy, because they were so full of Scripture that they wanted to read everything in light of Scripture and the principles of Scripture. So I think we need to make distinctions among those. But if you have read the Mishnah or the Talmud or so on, I don't think anybody who's based in a Talmudic hermeneutic would have any reason to complain about the way that the New Testament writers handled Scripture. It actually was quite ingenious. It wasn't always the way we would do it today, but you do have direct fulfillment. I mean, we have all through the prophets, you have this promise of the coming Davidic ruler. You also have the promise of God himself coming to deliver his people. You also have the promise in Daniel 7 of the Son of Man who's going to come and reign. You also have a suffering servant in Isaiah. And what we have in the New Testament that is distinct from the understanding of the contemporaries was, hey, it's actually more simple than what you think. All these were fulfilled in the same person. And just to give some examples of how we also have some analogies used in the New Testament. So, for example, Matthew chapter 2, out of Egypt I called my son, and applying that to Jesus. Well, in Hosea 11:1, the passage actually is talking about Israel in context. But Matthew knows very well that Hosea chapter 11 goes on to speak not only of first Exodus, where God brought his people out of Egypt, but goes on to make that the basis for a new Exodus, where God would bring his people again out of Egypt. So he's taking these theologically pregnant passages and showing how Jesus, how Yeshua, in his own life, recapitulates the history of Israel, identifies with the history of his people.
So you're saying that Matthew was not the first one to look at the Exodus eschatologically as a picture of the future. In other words, messianic interpretations of the Exodus, eschatological interpretations of the Exodus were already taking place by the prophets in the Old Testament.
The new Exodus is all over the place in the prophets. I mean, it's all over the place in Isaiah. It's explicit in Hosea chapter 2 and Hosea chapter 11 and so forth, in Jeremiah 23 and a number of other passages. Even in one of the most contested passages, in Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, cites Isaiah 7:14. And this is one of the most controversial passages, and I can certainly understand why, because my first time through Isaiah as a new believer, I get to Isaiah 7:14. I've already read Matthew 1:23, and I'm expecting this to be talking about the Messiah, and I read along in the context, and whoa, this is talking about something that happened like the 8th century, before the coming of Jesus, that this woman is going to have a child, and before the child is old enough to know good from bad, or to say my father, my mother, there's going to be the two lands whose kings King Ahaz was dreading would be carried away by the Assyrians. So don't join up with these two kings, Ahaz, because this is the sign the Lord is giving you that this woman is going to bear a child. Now, the term usually means a virgin, but I'm just going to leave that aside for the sake of the debate and talk about the context, because you get into the next chapter, and Isaiah's own son, Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz, he gets a name that symbolizes something that God is doing. And, while he's still young, while he's still a child, these two kings are going to be carried off into captivity. So I'm like, okay, so this must be Isaiah's own son who's going to be a sign. And then I get to 8:18, and it says that Isaiah's children are to be signs and wonders for the house of Israel. So it makes sense it's a sign. But what is a sign supposed to do? Is it so you can admire the colors in the sign? Or the purpose of a sign is to point to something beyond itself. And we see that as we go on in the next chapter, where to us a child is born, and the government, he'll rule over the house of David forever. So he's clearly a Davidic king. At the same time, he's also called the Prince of Peace and the Mighty God. And you can't say, well, it can't be a divine title, because in the very next chapter, in Isaiah chapter 10, it is a divine title. So Matthew was looking, I think, at the broader context that people often miss, that Isaiah's son was pointing to something beyond himself. And also when you look at the servant passages, clearly Isaiah 42 is talking about Israel as God's servant. And you keep going in Isaiah 44, Israel my servant. You get to Isaiah 49, Israel my servant. But then it starts speaking of one within Israel who would bear the sins of Israel. And again in Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12, one who suffers on behalf of Israel, even though he'd done nothing wrong, even though back in Isaiah 40 it says Israel was receiving double for her sins. So, and again in Isaiah 42:18, who is blind but my servant, is so deaf as my messenger whom I send. So you have the broader servant, the mission of Israel, but then within Israel, you have one who fulfills the mission on behalf of the people. And so the kind of play that you have in Matthew's gospel between the Jesus on the one hand and Israel on the other, and you see it again in in Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus 3 times answers testing as he's in the wilderness, based on passages from Deuteronomy 6 and 8. And the first of the passages comes when Hasatan, when Satan confronts him and says, if you're really God's son, do this. And so Yeshua begins quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 8, but he knows the context of that, because the context of that is, this is what God does for his son, for Israel. Mm-hmm. And so Jesus himself is identifying with Israel in that passage, and all 3 texts that he quotes are from that context, and he's applying them to himself because he's going through the same kind of testing that Israel went through in the wilderness, and he's passing tests that not all of Israel passed the first time through. Sure. On behalf of his people. On
behalf of his people. So he didn't come to replace his people any more than the high priest didn't replace Israel. He represented Israel, or King David his victory over Goliath, he didn't replace Israel. He was Israel's champion, right? So that's a good point.
Even in Daniel 7, where it talks about the coming Son of Man, you've got these 4 beasts that represent 4 empires and the kings of those empires, starting with Babylon, and then the 4th one, I know it's debated, but in the 1st century anyway, it was understood as Rome. But then after these 4 empires, or actually in the days of the 4th empire, you have another kingdom and another king portrayed not as a beast, but as a human one, is one like the Son of Man. He embodies God's kingdom and God's promised king for his people. And that's why he identifies with the saints of the Most High in the context who are persecuted under this final evil empire, which makes sense of his own sufferings. But finally, the Son of Man is exalted. And not only is he exalted to reign forever, embodying God's kingdom and the king of God's kingdom, but it says he receives worship, and language that only means worship. And so we have the bringing together of human and divine already right there in Daniel chapter 7. And that fits Jesus, who came first to suffer under the hands of Rome. And sometimes people say, well, we weren't expecting a suffering Messiah. The idea of Messiah ben Joseph, the suffering Messiah, I think that may appear in rabbinic sources because of the Bar Kokhba revolt and so on. But in terms of what Scripture already talked about, the idea of a suffering Messiah who would suffer under Rome, he didn't come the first time through to conquer Rome because Rome was such a small issue. He came first to conquer death. And Rome will be taken care of.
Amen. Amen. Back to, also interestingly enough, in Isaiah chapter 7, if you actually look at Isaiah chapter 9 and Isaiah chapter 11, both passages that are quite clearly about the Messiah,
Yes.
the larger context actually seems to also place it in the days of Assyria. I say that simply because just because Isaiah 7 may look like it's in an Assyrian context, if you apply that logic to chapter 9 and in chapter 11, then you basically then have to say that those chapters aren't messianic either. But at least in rabbinic exegesis, Isaiah chapter 11 is clearly understood as messianic, even though it seems like the Messiah comes after chapter 10 when the king of Assyria falls.
It has to be messianic. It's talking
Exactly.
about God bringing peace through the son of David, the root of Jesse, and so on. And the God with us in Isaiah 7:14 fits pretty well with mighty God in chapter 9.
Absolutely.